Hello there, Internet. How are you? Good evening. Welcome to another crazy conversation with Matt. So, I saved this conversation for a nighttime conversation because I've been thinking about it all day. Um, and Biz had to talk me into doing it because I was kind of nervous about it. Um, so I want to talk about conspiracy theories and how they really don't help us very much. Um, and I want to talk about them from the framework as someone who deeply appreciates conspiracy theories. Uh, I think that a lot of us who find ourselves practicing alternative spirituality um, are, in a lot of instances, at least dabblers in conspiracy theory thinking. Um, they're a lot of fun. I'll just say that. Statement number one: conspiracy theories are a lot of fun. And you can go down a rabbit hole with a lot of conspiracy theories that are really insane and awesome. I mean, insane in the good way. Uh, but you can also go down conspiracy theory thinking that is truly insane. So it's important, first and foremost, to draw a distinction between conspiracy theories and uh, um, let's just say effective investigative journalism, right? I can be obsessed with conspiracy theories and not call myself an investigative journalist. Um, but I could be an investigative journalist who roots out a conspiracy and not be a conspiracy theorist. So before I say anything else about the topic, it's important for us to say very specifically that you can be one and you can be the other, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Um, I could really, really enjoy conspiracy theories, not let them rule my life, and through acts of investigative journalism, root out conspiracies. Okay. So I don't have monochrome points of view on conspiracy theorists, to say the least. But what I do want to speak about is why conspiracy theories and the thinking that leads to them can be a really difficult trap to get out of once we are stuck in them. And it's also really appealing to go down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory thinking. And it's important to mention that I think on the front end of this conversation, I want to kind of preface with saying systemic analysis of structural flaws is not the same thing as being a conspiracy theorist. And being a conspiracy theorist doesn't mean that you have an effective analytical model for breaking down systemic flaws, right? So these are things that are not, again, mutually exclusive, right? I can be a conspiracy theorist who can tell you about all of the crazy theories about what the government is doing and not have a good analytical model for breaking down what's actually going on and reading the pattern beyond attributing agency to a group of people and say they're the bad guys. That's the problem. If we get rid of them, then we'll get rid of the problem, right? But I could also say I am not a conspiracy theorist, but I have an extremely effective analytical model for breaking down structural systemic flaws and being able to look at the system and say, isn't that interesting how the system and the way the system is built feels, when you're on the receiving end of it, an awful lot like a conspiracy, an awful lot like a conspiracy theory, right? Like I have a theory about a conspiracy, But my theory is that systemically, this is oppressive, right? Or this is messed up, or this system, just like all systems, have ways of setting themselves up to be perpetuated, right? There's no, um, you don't have to have immediate, uh, you don't have to have immediate, uh, kind of cause and effect sorts of like, it's this small cabal, they're doing this, and as a result, all of these people are are part of this conspiracy, right? So conspiracy theorists, structural analysts, not always the same thing. Boom. Conspiracy theorist, investigative journalism, or journalists, not always the same thing. I just want to get those two things out of the way. Those that feels like a really important disclaimer to get out of the way. It only took me 6 minutes, but to get out of the way because those two things right there, in and of themselves, are really worthwhile conversations that I think everybody should be having on a regular basis in their own head and with the people they love, because it keeps us sane. I mean, like no BS, it keeps us sane. So I want to talk about why conspiracies and conspiracy theory thinking are so appealing. Conspiracy theories are really, really appealing because they help us ascribe agency and ascribe blame to a group. Doesn't matter necessarily what group, but it helps us take deep, profound uncertainty and unwellness in the world around us and say it's their fault. I'm just going to say it's a real strange coincidence that a lot of certain conspiracies tend to start blaming Jewish people. So when we look at the conspiracy theory, before we listen or before we accept too many of the details of the conspiracy, it's important to remember that we should probably start at the end and work our way back. Wait a minute. Okay, so you're telling me all of this? Who's to blame again? Okay, great. There's a lot of reasons for the easy scapegoat. There's a lot of reasons that we as a society would love to have an easy scapegoat. As someone who who really loved conspiracy theories when I was younger, like in my late teens, early 20s, I got into a lot of it because I was really seeing that climate change was really, really on my mind during high school and later. So this is 20 years ago, back when if you were like a hardcore climate change person, like you were way fringe, and being like, no, like they know about this. So at that point, I really started seeing like, okay, this isn't cool. I also, come from the Boston area where the investigative journalism around the Catholic sex scandals were broken, kind of first, kind of at least some of the bigger reporting on it was done. And so I got really into, kind of the way that business interests and religious interests and government interests. I was again mentioned a couple times a history buff. So we can look at the false flag operations that kicked off some of the Vietnam War. Sort of settings. And so, it's easy to see that there are lots of opportunities for us to say, people are acting to cover their own asses because they're doing some messed up stuff. And there's a lot of messed up stuff happening in the world, right? I remember when the pandemic first kicked off, right? And there was a lot of thinking around, I think it was called like Plandemic or whatever, and a lot of stuff that is out there, and it it makes the imagination salivate, right? It just gets you going in a way that's kind of enjoyable. Um, and I tend to be kooky enough in my thinking that I am a firm believer that you should always entertain a crazy idea, at least long enough to know it's crazy. And then kind of say, well, okay, that's kind of crazy. I don't know that I'm going to keep following that rabbit hole. Um, so, all fun, let fun be fun on some level. I talked yesterday about allowing ourselves to play with ideas, right? And on some level, people who know their history can really point out a lot of crazy interactions over a long period of time. But again, it's very compelling, and it really makes us want to believe the conspiracy theory. It really makes us want to go down the rabbit hole when we find something that's like, oh my God, this is really pointing out a pattern. My teacher used to really hammer this home, right? It's going to be very, very difficult to prove intention. It's going to be very, very difficult to prove conspiracy. It's going to be very, very difficult to prove a number of things. But what you can always generally do is find patterns. Human mind is particularly adept at finding and isolating and kind of replicating patterns. And so if we look at enough events, we'll be able to see these sort of patterns. And this is where some of the tricky stuff starts to um, come into the forefront. So once we start noticing those patterns, I talk a lot about this. Sorry, I have the hiccups. I talk a lot about this with with biz and with friends and all that sort of stuff. Once we observe, the trick is not to ascribe, just to stay at the level of observation. If I observe long enough without ascribing, more often than not, I'm going to notice something tricky, something that looks like blame, something that looks like conspiracy, but is actually part of a historical pattern that I can point to the inputs and outputs of. When we consider these things within the constructs of personal and group psychology, it actually becomes very easy to break down within a rational framework why people make the decisions they make. Conspiracy thinking and conspiracy theories are so appealing because they kind of remove us from responsibility. They kind of remove us from the scope, the scale, and the events of history. And rather than allowing history to be a series of events that influence one another and lead to one another, it's much easier to say that a group of people in particular made those things happen because they benefited X, X, or X, whatever. Which is not to say that those things don't benefit those people, which is not to say that those things didn't happen, which is not to say anything. But it's very difficult to do anything about anything else when we are just creating an enemy that is kind of omnipotent and omnipresent and omniscient, right? There's an element of a lot of conspiracy theories, or at least in a lot of instances, there's a lot of elements about conspiracy theories that are accurate reporting. The problem becomes when we start to ascribe specific agency to specific groups, we then let ourselves off the hook. Or we make them so much our enemy that the only way to deal with them is to engage in extrajudicial violence. This is really dangerous. This is really, really, really dangerous. And I don't want to be hyperbolic, but it is the type of thinking that leads to kind of mass delusion and mass empowerment of, we'll just loosely use the word strong men, not straw men. Because what we end up looking for when we can ascribe blame to a specific group is a messianic figure. We start to allow ourselves to look for somebody to save us. And the person that has to save us has to be strong enough to defeat the evil that we are now ascribing omnipotent, omnipresent powers to. And so nothing short of the strongest strongman will do. And this is where we start to, as a society, get ourselves into a lot of trouble. Whether we're doing that on a very small scale, where we end up with kind of cults of personality, or we're doing this on a large scale with cults of personality. We are ready and willing to give our own agency over to something in order to protect us. The tricky thing about the rest of this video for me is going to be doing this without providing any examples that make me seem like a conspiracy theorist. Because we can all, if we're looking, find moments in our recent past when we have allowed our fear of the other to overwhelm our group psychology. We can use that on a personal scale. Likely you will be able to find a social dynamic where that occurred. But likely you'll be able to recall maybe in the last 20 or so years, especially if you're a US citizen, maybe some events that have occurred that managed to really scar the collective psyche, that really led to some challenging dynamics within our internal structures. And the way that we have calcified around certain positions in an attempt to respond to that shared trauma. I'm going to slow it down a little bit there, okay? Because I don't want to come across as somebody who is looking to insult or who's looking to ascribe blame, right? This is a very discernible, describable kind of feature and function of group psychology. The trick is that once we can allow ourselves to stay in the observer mind and not be pulled into conflict and say, well, let's look at everything that's going on right now. Let's look at what's happening. Let's look at why it's happening. Let's look at how it's happening. Let's look at all of the events. A lot of times, people who take that tact end up sounding like they're apologizing for the events or defending the events. And so immediately, those who are scarred or traumatized or hurt can immediately retaliate against those people, because it's very easy for us to see understanding as apologizing for or being an apologist. And nobody likes an apologist, especially someone who's obsessed with the idea of a conspiracy. Um, so the trick here is how we are able to reclaim reality, reclaim agency, and move beyond it to a more inclusive understanding of our historical place in reality. And remember that we are just like the events, merely an outcome of a series of inputs. This can be a deeply disempowering and depressing position. So I want to be very sensitive to that. It's much more appealing, just like I said at the beginning of the video, to be able to point to the enemy, to claim my power, and I use air quotes very specifically there, because sometimes claiming my power just means engaging in what I mentioned in my mediation and justice video: revenge, retaliation, and retribution. Extrajudicial actions. And we start to think that we are justified, right? We start to think that we are justified in those actions. We start to think that we're right because they are wrong. And that's where we start to get ourselves into a lot of trouble. Collective action to remedy a structural problem is very slow. It requires the building of a consensus, and so it requires a considered discourse. Considered discourse, collective action, and longitudinal effort is deeply unsatisfying, and more often than not requires a tremendous amount of solidarity with people who aren't like us. Requires a lot of thoughtful considering of one's actions from the place of intention and thought, right? I actually am not really even considering my actions because I'm spending so much time considering my thoughts and my intentions. And it also requires us to step away from the idea that I alone can solve the problem. And it forces us to step away from the idea, in fact, that I might ever live to see the problem solved. And that, again, is a very depressing and disempowering position. Requires a lot of support, requires a lot of communal support for one another to move through that kind of sorrow. I say that as someone who has done the vast majority of that work entirely alone and over the course of my adolescence and adulthood, very much in isolation, because it is a very isolating position when your position is not in favor of the majority position. Again, I say that because I want to reference, I'm a we'll just say practitioner of alternative spirituality. Um and I've been seeing this uh kind of, it's not quite a meme, but it's not quite a series of studies or anything like that, but it maybe somewhere lives in the middle, talking about the overlaps between the F word, fascists, and folks in the New Age community. And I tend to agree with a lot of these overlapping statements. And the reason I tend to agree with it is I've given it a lot of thought, right? Because they basically just make a bunch of over generalized claims about both groups, and notice that they tend to overlap in a lot of places. And I don't disagree with it, but I don't fully agree with it either. But the thing that I've really identified for me is that those of us who are not in the majority position tend toward conspiratorial thinking, tend toward thinking which seeks to find the enemy. Everything acts as a result of a conspiracy. Everything moves by conspiracy. The beautiful part about capitalism is that it allows everybody to be protected in the engagement of a conspiracy, because everybody can just say, I was just doing my job. History is littered with people who were just doing their job. It's important to remember that. History is full of people who are just doing their job. And for me, that's never been a good enough excuse. So I've chosen to put my ethical concerns before my material concerns. And that has caused me a great amount of material instability through my life, but more often than not, a lot of happiness. I was very lucky to have chosen kind of a more spiritual orientation to life. And so, more often than not, a meditation cell with a bedroll and a bookcase and a altar was enough for me. And that's okay. But it doesn't have to be for everybody. So I want to say that for me, I want to say that for others, right? We all have to find where we can live with ourselves in all of this. We might know something's wrong, and we might end up needing to be complicit in it in order to survive. It's okay. It's okay. The world is full of people just doing their jobs. If evil can be done by conspiracy, then so can good. Right? Because what is a conspiracy? Conspiracy is really just individuals deciding to work together to achieve a shared aim. if we're going to move beyond simple scapegoat conspiracy theory thinking and move toward a more communal understanding of how we can act together to create collective change, then we have to stop seeing anybody as the other and start saying, are you aligned with the outcome? If so, here's what we can do. This unfortunately requires us to agree on what we're going to do, which is where a lot of the trick comes in, right? This is why, for me, moving beyond transactional thought, transactional relationships, and moving into building trust, building connection, building genuine care for one another is so much our work as spiritual practitioners in this time. It's not about how can I make a living, it's about how can we all keep living. It's a different question. And so if we all are going to keep living, yes, on some level, we are going to have to identify the problems. I'm going to bring us all the way back. Just because I can point to a conspiracy theory doesn't mean that I have a good mechanism for structural analysis. And if I have a good method for structural analysis, I might not ascribe to conspiracy theory. But just because they are not always the same thing doesn't mean that they're not sometimes pointing to the same truth. This is going to be where I bring up a challenging truth, which is to say that I think a lot more of us have a lot more in common today than we'd like to admit. But we're engaging with the problems from different levels of analysis, different levels of thinking. I'm going to go over my usual time here probably because I want to make this final point. We have to go beyond seeing the differences and we have to start finding the similarities. We have to start finding the unifying components of our shared experience. We are all living in this time and in this place together. I believe in a transcendent spiritual framework because we are all born into the same universe together. We are all here together. That means we're all responsible for what we do next. Where we've been is extremely important for us all to understand. We all have to come to terms with our history. Now is the time. Now is the time when we have this relatively short window of peace. And ideally, you've been doing it for the last 25, 50 years, when we had a much longer window of relative peace. If you haven't, don't worry about it. There are a lot of people who've done a lot of work. It's time to do a lot of listening. It's time to do a lot of learning. Our transcendent conception of the divine is everything. Everything is divine. You, me, the screen that you're watching on, the camera filming me, the friggin' desk holding the computer, it's all God. Whatever word you want to use, it's all beautiful and perfect and fucked up and imperfect and flawed, and we're doing the best we can. We have to see the patterns. We have to acknowledge that things have been fucked up. We have to move beyond blame. we have to move beyond scapegoats, because scapegoats always lead to one type of thinking: us versus them. The only way we get out of this is together. The only way we get out of this is together. That means the people who fucked up have to be a part of the solution too. That means the people who didn't always put principle before profit have to be a part of the solution too. Which requires us to take the unsatisfying position. Requires us to take the slow, high, long, hard road. I'm glad I recorded this evening. I think I added successfully our Instagram, Facebook, and website links to our YouTube information, so check those out if you're interested. I don't care. As I've said, these particular lectures are more for me than anyone else. If you've made it this far, particularly with this video, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you've been following these videos, thank you, thank you, thank you. They are an important part of me coming into my place of communicating this work, because I feel about this how I expressed today. And so, thank you. Have a blessed evening. I'll be back kind of probably in the middle of the day tomorrow, maybe earlier in the morning, who knows. Have a blessed evening, and see you next time.